Hello, and welcome to this Wilson Center Canada Institute event on a recently negotiated joint action plan on critical minerals collaboration between the United States and Canada. My name is Christopher Sands, and I'm director of the Canada Institute at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And we have a tremendous panel today, 3 speakers, and then we'll have some comments to follow. We have Dr. Sarah Riker, who is Associate Director of Energy and Minerals at the U.S. Geological Survey. We have Andrew Gaddis, who is Director of the Critical Minerals Task Force for Policy and Economics Branch, Land and Mineral Sector of NRCan, Natural Resources Canada. And providing a comment, we have a Global Fellow of the Canada Institute, Robert Johnson, who is Managing Director of Energy, Climate and Resources and an Executive Advisor at the Eurasia Group. We're going to start with Sarah Riker from the U.S. Geological Survey to talk about the agreement and where we go from here. Sarah.
Thank you. Let me share my slides to you. I hope you're seeing a slide deck.
It looks good.
Thank you. First, I want to give you an especially warm thank you, Chris and Wilson Center Canada Institute, for teeing up this discussion. I know you're well aware that the US and Canada are in a series of really productive conversations about our current and future mineral dependencies and our scientific and trade cooperation related to minerals. So it's great timing to share some of the directions we're taking and some of the motivation for that relationship. So I want to highlight some of the commonalities that the US and Canada share in this space. We're really in similar circumstances in that both countries are rich in minerals, and both, and really all developed nations, depend on trading partners for a significant portion of our mineral commodities. And both the US and Canada are seeing technology transitions in many sectors that are really increasing our dependence on minerals. For example, the World Bank recently published the statistic that an electric vehicle contains 5 times more copper and 4 times more manganese than a conventional car, and also requires significant amounts of lithium, nickel, and cobalt. And those are minerals that are virtually absent in a conventional car. So all these emerging technologies are exciting and are creating feedbacks in our supply chains that we need to at least catch up to, if not get ahead of. I also want to note that my agency, the U.S. Geological Survey within the U.S. Department of the Interior, is a close counterpart to the Geological Survey of Canada within Natural Resources Canada. So today you should hear a very complementary set of perspectives, and actually that close match between both the economic interests and the specific expertises of our 2 nations is really the cornerstone of the collaboration that we're building in critical minerals. So I just want to highlight first off that minerals, and particularly critical minerals, are a complicated space. It's an area that really takes a village, and the US federal government has been assembling its village internally, as well as developing these relationships with our neighbors in Canada. So I'm just highlighting here that for almost 10 years, the US federal government has been addressing critical mineral issues through an interagency body under the National Science and Technology Council. And that interaction has really built the knowledge infrastructure required to strengthen our domestic collaborations and establish agreement internally on what constitutes a critical mineral, and also on how to adapt those definitions over time as new applications emerge. That activity, as I said, has been going on for about 10 years, but there's been a real uptick in activity recently. In 2017, we had both a presidential executive order and the Department of the Interior secretarial order on critical minerals, and those led to development of an interagency federal strategy on critical mineral supply chains. And that interagency body today oversees implementation of the federal strategy. So I've just listed here the 6 calls to action under the whole of government strategy. And I want to highlight that the very first step in developing the strategy was to identify what today would we consider critical minerals. And that doesn't mean it's all the minerals that matter. Minerals matter in almost every industry. from construction through advanced manufacturing. But the Executive Order of 2017 set a definition for the present day of critical minerals that's in part dependent on sectoral manufacturing relationships and in part dependent on our trade dependencies. So in 2018, we developed a list of 35 critical minerals that's based on USGS data, but really vetted through a large interagency process. The process established 10 years ago. And since then, we've been working to the remainder of these calls to action under the whole of government strategy with special focus on those 35 minerals. And so I want to just highlight that all this effort is really driven by the recognition that we're all depending on an increasing volume and variety of mineral commodities in almost every sector. So just to show you a few charts. I'm from a science agency, we love our numbers. So on the left is a chart of the degree to which the US relies on imports for a long list of mineral commodities. And the percentage of dependence on imports is the middle column in blue. And then the import sources are listed on the right of that graphic. This is updated every year in the mineral commodity summaries that we produce in late January. On the right-hand side, you can see an illustration of the way the number of mineral commodities that we depend on imports for is increasing over time. But this is really at the level of commodities and trade relationships. This really is about calls to action 2 and 3, which are about specific sectors, supply chains, and trade relationships. Now, if I dive in one level deeper, I want to say that all of this analysis really puts a premium on data and analytics and forecasting, especially in understanding the future technology trajectories that I mentioned at the beginning. So part of our role at the USGS and part, of course, of Natural Resource Canada's role has been to quantify trends in the nation's reliance. And on this slide, I just want to say, first of all, the US is, again, well endowed with minerals. And even so, we have some pretty dramatic dependencies. So here, on the left, I'm highlighting actually the entire periodic table of elements. And in black, I've highlighted gallium and a group of the rare earth elements. Gallium and the rare earths are essential to many defense and national security technologies, as well as renewable energy generation technologies. So those are illustrated on the right. I want to mention, by the way, that I selected China as an example of our dependencies based on those two families of technologies at right, and not with any foreknowledge of the Attorney General's remarks yesterday on rare earths and China policy. But these topics are just so hot that, that we have these coincidences constantly. So just want to emphasize that we're able to do this kind of analysis now for any particular country that we rely on and for any particular bundle of technologies and economic sectors as shown at right. And so, you know, we're continuing now to examine US reliance on imports from a number of categories of trade partners. And we are in particular at the moment looking at groups of trade partners, such as Canada, of course, and other reliable trade partners. I think another valid group to examine is the other large economies, such as Russia and China. And then there's the rest of the world, because the types of minerals that we depend on are so varied. We also trade for them in a variety of places around the world. And I emphasize this way of looking at trade relationships as groups to emphasize that we often focus on China and Russia, but in fact the US doesn't rely heavily on those countries for most commodities. If you look at that periodic table, the darkness of the color indicates our degree of dependence on that country, in this case China. And most of the periodic table is not dark red. So that indicates that we have a domestic source or we're reliant on other countries. And that said, the few dark red elements there are, such as gallium and the rare earth elements, do indicate commodities for which, if needed, we could look elsewhere for trade. So this type of data set and this type of analysis is really increasing the precision with which we can assess our future trade needs, as well as our other options for obtaining those commodities. Here, I'm going to dive in one level deeper and not look at entire products or entire sectors, such as renewable energy generation or defense, but really zoom in on components that support many areas of manufacturing. This is analysis published in February in Science Advances by a USGS team. And this analysis identifies at right, in the second from right column, again, not whole technologies, but supply risks identifying components of those technologies. So for example, permanent magnets, advanced ceramics, catalytic converters, and other building blocks of many present day and emerging technologies. So in a sense, this more detailed analysis of those building blocks allows us to be much more flexible in anticipating what future technologies and combinations of these smaller technologies may require. So again, this is now building up to an analysis of trade dependencies, of which portions of the periodic table, which mineral commodities are used in what types of technologies, and which of those technologies may combine for specific manufacturing sectors. So just an illustration of the way that we are fine-tuning our data and really working at being able to forecast farther ahead and better understand what the potential consequences of breaks in the supply chain may be for more and more specific portions of our manufacturing economy. Here, I'm going to transition to showing some previous collaboration between the US and Canada that provides a useful backdrop, I think, to the Joint Action Plan. At left, I have listed the 5 elements of the Joint Action Plan, and in the middle, the graphic illustrates what we know today of our specific interdependencies between the US and Canada for several technology metals. And this analysis was developed by the USGS and Natural Resources Canada, and it looks at the whole of North America as a trade bloc. So in green, you see the US dependence on any partner for trade for a dozen minerals, circa 2014. And in blue, you see the whole North America region's dependence on trading partners outside the region. So in short, much of what you see here is that by trading within North America, we really reduce our external dependencies pretty significantly for most of these technology metals, though not all. And so the reason we look at this continent scale is really to understand potential for future collaboration and where we can reduce vulnerabilities through new trade agreements. And under the Joint Action Plan, we're actually working to update and focus and refine this analysis as a basis for much more granular discussions of trade. And I think I'll close by highlighting another piece of our work under the action plan that's really about data exchange. On the US side, I will say that we don't yet have a full picture of what mineral commodities we do and don't import from Canada, and what additional commodities might be attractive for increased trade. So with Canada, under the Joint Action Plan, we're launching an exchange of data to help identify any commodities for which the US is reliant on imports, but not on Canada, and for which Canada has production. So for the longer run, we're going to then be able to apply those data, I believe, to better understand each other's longer term resources as well. So initially we're looking at where is their production, where is their trade, where isn't there trade. And for the longer term, we're working to better understand where might there be production in the future, and where might Canada become a long-term strategic trading partner. So just as one illustration, I want to mention that under the US federal strategy, earlier I highlighted calls to action 2 and 3, which are on specific economic sectors and their trade dependencies. Canada is also essential to call to action 4, which calls on us, the US government, to improve our understanding of domestic critical mineral resources. And that includes a below ground piece and an above ground piece. In the below ground piece, the USGS and our state geological surveys have launched the Earth Mapping Resources Initiative to provide better foundational geoscience information that, among many other applications, will help us better understand our own critical mineral deposits below ground, minerals still in the ground in this country. That effort, the Earth Mapping Resources Initiative, is strongly inspired by work in both Canada and Australia. Frankly, the US is somewhat behind both of those countries in conducting modern mapping of our lands. And so we are very much looking at Canadian and Australian examples and lessons learned to chart our path. And we are developing common mineral systems approaches to doing so, in part because a list of 35 critical minerals may sound small, but in fact, it's a lot of minerals to study at once, and even more minerals for which to assess trade relationships. So by taking mineral systems approaches, we're looking at groups of minerals at the same time. And in fact, of course, that's how they occur in the ground. So for those approaches, we are again leaning on long-standing science from both Canada and Australia. So very much appreciate the science benefits we're reaping there. I'll also mention for the longer term, we are working to better document the intricacies of our trade relationships. For example, during the full life cycle of minerals production, processing, and incorporation into manufacturing, there are many commodities that move back and forth across the US-Canada border, and in some cases also overseas and back at different value-added steps. And so tracing some of those key commodities life cycles is a gap that we believe with closer collaboration with Canadian colleagues, we can now fill and better understand really where the value add is happening. So in the coming months, we expect to publish an updated analysis of our North American trade patterns, and also in the longer run, develop a joint look ahead at emerging and longer run future technologies and manufacturing needs that again will help us forecast better in what areas we need those adapted trade relationships. So I think I will stop there, and I hope I've teed up a similar discussion by our Canadian colleagues. In short, we have a really shared set of priorities for critical minerals, and I think a lot of complementarity in our approaches to the economies for supply. And the Joint Action Plan hits on quite a number of the areas in which we feel we really benefit from that partnership. Thanks.
Wonderful, Sarah. Thank you very, very much. And now let's turn to Andrew Gaddis for the Canadian side of this equation. Over to you, Andrew.
Great. Thanks so much for having me, Chris and Sarah. It's a real pleasure to be with you all today. And thank you for setting aside your time to discuss critical minerals and Canada-US collaboration in this area. My name is Andrew Gaddis. I'm the director of the Critical Minerals Task Force with Natural Resources Canada. Full disclosure, I'm new to critical minerals and mining in general. My exposure has mainly been through kind of other policy work with respect to international trade, defense procurement, foreign direct investment, and perhaps an area where everything seems to be intersecting these days, kind of the economic security realm. So this, this nexus between the kind of the security and the economic worlds. But a general newbie to this area for sure. But I think what really drew me to this particular position and this file was just how multifaceted critical minerals are. I mean, we're talking about innovation on the tech front, the geopolitical dynamics, you have the economics associated with the markets, you have environmental concerns, but also opportunities. And then obviously there's a social aspect with respect to social licensing, and particularly in Canada, mining in rural communities, and impacts on First Nations, all of which kind of come together. And I mean, if you work in a policy field, which is where my team and I reside, you really couldn't ask for a more multifaceted file, which has only been heightened by COVID, and a greater focus on global supply chains and supply chain resiliency. So really exciting and dynamic file, and very fast paced at the moment. I'm just going to share my screen and have a few slides to kind of run you through. All right, so hopefully you can see that okay. All right, so I think Sarah touched on this already, but while COVID has clearly presented incredible challenges for both our governments and obviously around the world, The pandemic has really shone a light on the issue of supply chain security for key sectors of the economy. We know that the global economy is going to be increasingly dependent on a number of minerals and metals, and demand is only going to grow, including those areas for clean technologies, which are integral to the global transition to a low carbon economy and a low carbon future, as well as in the defense and security space and your everyday consumer electronics and critical infrastructure, which sometimes doesn't get us much discussion relative to some of the other spaces. We face a situation where the production and processing of many of critical minerals is often highly concentrated in just one or two countries. And apologies. I think that's something that adds another layer of complexity to this situation. In some cases, these are non-market economies or operations where there are significant concerns around protections for workers and the environment. And the situation presents a risk to global supply chains writ large. For Canada, the government has set a target to achieve net zero CO2 emissions by 2050. And that requires ramping up renewable energy and storage, the broad deployment of electric vehicles. And we can't do that without the minerals and metals needed for these technologies. Many of us have seen some of the market projections for critical minerals by organizations like the International Energy Agency and the World Bank. And I think Sarah touched on the growing demand with respect to lithium production and cobalt for batteries earlier in her presentation. So the demand is there. So this slide just kind of shows some of the kind of the tension points to assess that criticality. But I want to talk a bit more about the Canadian opportunity. So I think that generally speaking, this part of the narrative is well understood and growing by the day. Perhaps the level of dependence on some sources of supply for certain minerals and metals might not be fully understood, but I think definitely the overall importance and of critical minerals into global supply chains and their importance to domestic economies is really starting to resonate. But so where does Canada fit in within this picture? Canada's mineral and metal sector is already a major contributor to the Canadian economy. 2018, Canada produced over 60 minerals and metals that were worth nearly $47 billion. In the same year, this is a direct employer over 400,000 people across the country, directly and indirectly. We're a global leader already in many minerals, including those in advanced battery technologies. So cobalt, nickel, graphite starting to grow as well. And we're also kind of a global mining leader, and we have a long-standing commitment to sustainable development of natural resources, which allows us to kind of differentiate ourselves from some of our competitors in this space. And so our government believes that this commitment also makes Canada an attractive destination in terms of looking at further investment to grow this important space. So as an established producer of many critical minerals, Canada believes it is even greater potential to strengthen our role as a reliable, sustainable global supplier. Importantly, we want to develop the associated downstream industries, such as the battery value chain. So apart from getting these critical minerals out of the ground, we want to leverage our resource wealth and innovation capabilities to spur midstream activities like separating and processing. And this part is crucial because without the processing and refining capacity, you still kind of can remain dependent on one or two markets for advanced staged inputs. And this kind of goes all to other downstream activities too. And as we're seeing some of these notions of the circular economy emerge, so it includes recycling as well. Our overall approach is grounded in a recent plan that was developed called the Canadian Minerals and Metals Plan. So this is a policy framework co-developed with provincial and territorial governments, industry and Indigenous groups. It reflects today's realities, as mentioned. I mentioned at the outset in terms of some of the themes that emerge within this space. So it touches on climate change, Indigenous participation, sustainable development, and social acceptability, which are all key elements of having a kind of a successful industry. The plan will guide our work with provinces and territories on actions to improve economic competitiveness of the minerals and metals sector and to capitalize on new opportunities, including in critical minerals. So that brings me to the next point in terms of why an action plan with the US. So Efforts to build a resilient global critical mineral supply chain demand international cooperation. And Canada and the US are natural allies in this regard. I mean, with geography alone, but also, shared values and shared interests. Our nations depend on each other for mutual prosperity and security. And obviously we have a long-standing bilateral defense and trade partnership, which gives us a solid foundation on which to build, particularly given the extent of integration between our two economies already. Canada already represents a secure and resilient source of supply of metals and minerals imports to the US. We're currently an important supplier of 13 of the 35 minerals deemed critical by the US. And we also have the potential to supply many more. For example, we're a leading supplier in areas such as uranium, potash, indium, and tellurium. The US obviously represents a leading source of investment potential for Canada and critical mineral supply chains, given market size, proximity, and existing integration. The US is Canada's top partner for mining sector trade and investment and the leading destination for Canadian mining assets abroad. In 2018, 251 Canadian mining and exploration companies held assets in the US valued at about $19 billion. So again, the degree of integration is quite high already. In addition, in particular within the mining, the space writ large. Our countries have mutual interests and synergies with respect to critical minerals. We have Canadian companies working with US partners on projects in the US. We have excellent collaboration between our respective geological surveys, as Sarah mentioned, in mineral mapping and modeling. We have common R&D programs in our national labs, and we care about the same issues around responsible mining governance and national security. And we are working with many of the same allies in this space. And I think collaboration really represents an opportunity for mutual benefit by jointly addressing security and defense concerns, facilitating greater minerals trade and investment, increasing industry competitiveness in both Canada and the US. So again, Sarah's slides kind of touched on some of the aspects of the joint action plan, but just a little bit of by way of background. Our respective leaders recognized the importance of an integrated North American approach when they committed to developing the joint action plan on critical minerals collaboration in June 2019. It was finalized this past January. The plan will position our bilateral cooperation to make a significant contribution to broader efforts with our allies to address supply chain challenges. Canada-US collaboration is, again, focused on areas like industry engagement, securing critical mineral supply chains for strategic industries and defense, and improving information sharing on mineral resources and potential, R&D collaboration, and advancing efforts in multilateral fora with third countries. While our bilateral engagement slowed a degree as a result of the pandemic, a number of activities have nonetheless moved forward. For example, in December 2019, in advance of finalizing the action plan, Canada joined the US-led Energy Resource Governance Initiative, which is a multi-country effort promoting sound mining sector governance and secure and resilient supply chains for critical energy minerals. Canada has contributed to the ERGI toolkit and partnered with the US to launch the product on the margins of the International Mines Ministers Summit in March 2020. On March 2nd, 2020, on the margins of the 2020 Prospectors Development Association of Canada Convention in Toronto, senior officials from NRCan and the US Department of Commerce hosted a Canada-US industry roundtable to identify common challenges and opportunities related to strengthening the North American supply chain for critical minerals and boosting industry competitiveness. This discussion was met with strong support from our industries collectively. Again, as Sarah mentioned, NRCan's Geological Survey of Canada has continued its work with its counterparts in the US and Australia to create a data portal on known conventional critical mineral deposits and discuss how the three scientific organizations can work together to address data gaps. There's also some interesting work going on in this space with respect to using artificial intelligence to try to map some of the deposits, which is less invasive and obviously better for the environment writ large. So innovation happening in all spaces. And obviously there's ongoing discussions between industry stakeholders and government officials regarding potential critical minerals projects to move forward. I think this is a key aspect to really move the relationship to the next level. Most recently, on June 17th, Canada and the US held the second working group meeting under our joint action plan on critical minerals virtually. The meeting provided a great opportunity to share information related to the effects of the COVID pandemic on the mining sector, provide updates on work undertaken to date under the action plan, and highlight our respective priority issues. I think in conclusion, I already touched on it in large respects, but it just makes perfect sense for Canada and the US to collaborate in this space. Again, particularly given the level of integration and our shared priorities in a host of areas. I would say that market forces alone will not be sufficient to achieve the Canada and US's strategic critical minerals objectives. There's a role for both governments to play to ensure the discovery, development, processing of critical minerals and manufacturing of downstream projects in both our countries to ensure greater supply chain resiliency. And I'm looking forward to future collaboration with my US colleagues in this respect. Thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Andrew. And the complementarity of your presentation and Sarah's is quite impressive. Let me turn now to Robert Johnston, Global Fellow at the Canada Institute here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and an expert on, among other things, minerals and energy resources at the Eurasia Group. Robert?
Chris, thank you very much. It's good to be with everyone this morning and look forward to sharing some thoughts here on the critical minerals issue. Of course, my perspective is a little bit different. I'm not a government policymaker. I'm a consultant. Eurasia Group's focus is on the intersection between policy, geopolitics, and financial markets and industry. So we kind of look at this from the perspective of our private sector clients and investors and how they're seeing some of the issues in the critical mineral space that are really at the heart of this US-Canada agreement. So I'll make some more macro comments on the space and the deal specifically to fuel the discussion here a little bit. So I think, the critical minerals issue is the latest in a long connection, I think, in US policy between energy and national security. And these days, of course, the US is much less insecure on oil and gas, thanks to the shale development. But one could argue that critical minerals, based on the data that we just heard, may be a new vulnerability, a different kind of vulnerability, but a new vulnerability. Particularly if you consider the possibility that critical minerals may be the fuel for 21st century sectors like information technology and clean renewable technology in the same way that oil was for the internal combustion engine in the 20th century. So we're talking about a very strategic sector here, not just directly, but because of its broad economic impacts. And of course, as my colleagues in the panel mentioned, there's a lot of focus right now in the era of COVID on supply chains, on disruption vulnerabilities, potential supply shocks, where the secure source of production. And again, that language is very reminiscent of how the US used to talk about oil and gas as well. Then you add in the Trump administration policies that backstop the critical minerals dialogue that we're talking about, particular focus on minerals that have military applications or dual use applications, and or that have a large share of supply coming from China. And if you look at the DOE definition of a critical mineral, it specifically references materials that are essential to the economic and national security in the United States, and that have supply chains that are vulnerable to disruption, right? So again, this language is very much the kind of language we've heard with energy and national security discussions around oil and gas for the last decades as well. Now, I would say that critical minerals align both with conservative and progressive policy interests. On the conservative side, you have the sort of military dimension, the national security advantage or vulnerability. And then on the progressive side, you have the possibility of using more critical minerals to enable a low carbon energy transition. So in other words, it's that rare bipartisan area of interest in both Washington and Ottawa these days. So I won't rehash what my colleague said about the role of critical minerals in energy transition. It's certainly well understood, not just wind turbines and battery storage, but things like energy efficient light bulbs, hybrid vehicles, magnets, solar photovoltaic cells that are all requiring raw materials from the critical mineral space. And I think we can agree that although the pace of the energy transition may be slower with COVID, or it may be faster under one administration than another, depending which country you're looking at, the demand for these critical minerals will grow. And I was just on a call with the International Energy Agency, where they're really talking about $2 trillion a year of spending necessary to achieve the Paris Agreement. And it's fair to say that the critical minerals that go into the renewable energy sources would constitute a significant portion of that $2 trillion. You look at the Biden campaign talking about installing 500 million solar panels, 8 million solar roofs, 60,000 made in America wind turbines. That's just one example of the jump that we're going to see, whether or not it's Biden or another president, whether it's the US or other countries, the type of policy drivers that are really shaping demand for critical minerals within the clean energy transition. Now, if we look at this from a geopolitical perspective, we talked about US energy security. What about China's energy security? Right, I would argue that as China decarbonizes its economy and reduces its dependence on oil and gas, they will actually be more secure from a geopolitical perspective and more self-reliant in an energy mix that's dominated by clean tech and batteries than they ever were with oil and gas. They actually have a very strong position in the supply chain for electric vehicles, for batteries, for solar panels. They have the critical minerals at one end, and they have the OEMs doing the battery manufacturing, the solar panel manufacturing at the other end, and everything in between. So they'll be reducing their dependence on places like Saudi Arabia and Russia for imports of fossil fuels, and more self-reliant in clean tech, and that includes this critical mineral discussion that we're talking about. Now, will that extend influence for China over other major Asian economies that depend on critical minerals, countries like Japan and Korea? That's interesting for us to consider as well. So that's one broad bucket of issues around energy security and energy transition. Let me talk also about something that Andrew mentioned in his comments about sustainability and the greening of supply chains. When we look at critical minerals, it's pretty clear that the OEMs and big information technology companies that are the ultimate consumers of these critical minerals, they're facing a lot of investor scrutiny over their performance on environment, social and governance issues, or ESG issues. Part of this is about climate change, but it's also about things like human rights, labor, and local environmental impact, where ESG is really having a big impact. So when it comes to firms like Apple or Toyota, BMW, Walmart, they have a very immense power to influence supply chains, including for critical minerals. And they need to assure their customers increasingly and their shareholders that the raw materials and critical minerals that go into their end products are aligned with the best ESG standards, human rights, labor, local environmental impact. So I would say that when we look at critical minerals from investors and customers are now facing the same or greater supply chain scrutiny that industries like the forest products, textiles and apparel, or seafood have dealt with in the past. And in those industries, we have to ask now for critical minerals, who's going to set the standards and provide transparency for critical minerals production to determine who is sustainable and who isn't. And then the key question of, and this is I think quite relevant for Canada and other alternative sources in China, will those companies and customers pay more for critical minerals that are more aligned with these ESG standards? That's at times can be difficult in very highly competitive sectors like high tech and clean technology. But it's worth noting that U.S. policy specifically states that they're looking for closer cooperation in critical minerals with major mining economies that have similar health, safety, and environmental concerns as the U.S. So I think that from a public sector perspective and a private sector investor perspective, this ESG or health, safety, environmental concern is very critical and will reshape, I think, the critical minerals markets towards suppliers that have more higher standards in these areas. I thought Andrew made a good point mentioning recycling. I think that investors are also very focused on the so-called circular economy, and where we can actually recapture and reuse a lot of these critical minerals and therefore reduce the carbon footprint and environmental impact of producing new sources. Let me make a quick point about supply chains. I would agree with my colleagues that certainly COVID has put a real focus on the vulnerabilities of long extended global supply chains for things like critical minerals. And that when you have mining sources in remote countries that may not have the best healthcare standards or may have concentrations where it's difficult for social distancing for workers in mines, you could see significant disruptions because some of these minerals are quite specialized and literally only have a very small handful of production sources. So if one source gets hit by COVID and it's in a distant country with poor healthcare infrastructure, you could have a major supply disruption. So certainly the COVID pandemic has escalated focus on shorter supply chains, on reshoring, and on the key word resilience right? A lot of what my colleagues talked about was resilience in the context of national security and trade policy, but it's also true in the context of pandemics. Then we have the geopolitics of supply chains around China, of course. And Eurasia Group's top risk for this year, really and last year as well, was the US-China relationship. The rise of geotechnology, the merger of geopolitical and technology concerns, the decoupling of the US and China tech sectors, which had worked so closely together. And I think the trade friction between the US and China is changing the incentives for the US, the EU, Japanese, and Korean manufacturers, among others, in terms of where they're sourcing their manufacturing and raw materials for technology, China versus other sectors, and that includes critical minerals. The risk of it sourcing from China has gone up when there's been this contentious relationship with the US, particularly in areas like semiconductors, supercomputers, and artificial intelligence, where critical minerals will be playing a key role. Let me conclude with a quick comment on the US-Canada energy relationship. I agree with my colleagues that the US-Canada energy relationship, and indeed the larger economic relationship, is strategic. There's a long history primarily of cooperation and mutual interest, but there's occasional friction. There's no doubt about that if we look at energy, for example, whether it was Harper and Obama or Trudeau and Trump, there hasn't always been alignment on energy and climate policy issues. Obama's denial of the Keystone XL permit, Trump's withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, some of the issues that have created, some tension in the energy bilateral relationship. Then you have the fact that shale oil and gas development in the US, I would say it's reshaped US dependence on Canadian oil and gas, but by no means eliminated it. It just means that it's not quite as high an issue of pecking order as it may have been, say, 10 years ago. So within this context, I think cooperation on critical minerals makes a lot of sense. It may be that the Trump and Trudeau governments have slightly different objectives, partially overlapping, partially different. There's a strong national security and industrial policy dimension in Washington, along with this China hedge. Maybe in Ottawa, there's an element of the clean energy transition that was mentioned. But overall, I think interests overlap quite well. Under Biden, these interests might be even further aligned if we do see a change in administration here in Washington, because as mentioned, Biden's focus on the clean energy transition would put a even greater call on the need for critical minerals from ESG-friendly markets. But lastly, a cautionary note for Canada that Canada is, we can see with the Huawei dispute, the two Michaels imprisoned in China, that Canada's sort of a price taker in the US-China relationship, and that the extent that we're partnering with the US and decoupling from China does come with some risk in the Canada-China relationship as well, which is something that Canadian policymakers are struggling with in the current environment. So those are some broad macro thoughts to add to the discussion, Chris, and I hope that's helpful and look forward to the rest of the discussion. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Robert. That was absolutely concise but impactful. I thought it was a tremendous presentation. One of the things that is important, particularly from a Canada point of view, is the split within the Canadian Federation of responsibility when it comes to mineral extraction and land use and so forth. I've asked two of the Canadian provinces with representation in Washington if they would be willing to talk a little bit about what they're doing. Moving from east to west, like the sun, I thought I would start with Catherine Loubier, who's Quebec's Delegate General in New York, who oversees the Washington office. Catherine, can I turn it over to you?
Yes, hi. Can you hear me well, Chris?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone, and for the invitation as well. I think the presentations were extremely interesting. I've learned a lot. Thank you. So Quebec, and particularly the north of Quebec, as you know, holds rich and diversified resources, including those in new technologies that I've heard our panelists talk about, whether it's cobalt or the platinum group elements, zinc, iron, diamonds, lithium, vanadium, and rare earths, of course. I think that I want to make a few points. So Quebec has a very dynamic business environment. We are extremely engaged as a government in pushing our strategic mineral industry, our critical minerals. In fact, Chris and I have worked on a special project when he was at Johns Hopkins, so on critical minerals. And we have institutional investors based in Quebec, and so we're actually able to invest in some of the projects that come to us. The tax incentives are quite aggressive as well, and we have a skilled workforce. We've been doing research for 40 years on critical minerals. But we also have abundant clean hydroelectricity, and this is a huge advantage when you think that 99.8% of electricity produced in Quebec comes from renewables, 4% of that being wind and the rest hydroelectricity. Hydro-Quebec, our power company, also has been studying batteries for over 40 years. And we have put forward a lithium-ion battery strategy. And one of the things we're really proud of is our ability to have a very straightforward process for consultation on environment and also with Indigenous communities in Quebec. We're very proud of that track record, and I think it's pretty unique when you look at the different countries that hold these minerals, how Quebec was successful in developing these minerals in an environmental way. And I think we're very well positioned for sustainable development of critical minerals that I've heard just now being mentioned, and recycling, the circular economy. I also want to point out that we've been doing extensive research in mining. I look forward also to finding out more about the USGS collaboration that we've embarked on mapping and information of those minerals. And the government of Quebec is extremely open to US investment in our critical and strategic mineral sector. We've done a lot of trade missions. We continue to do so in the US. And just to table on what I think Andrew has said, Quebec and Canada have a long-standing friend and ally of the US. And so we definitely want to increase collaboration on critical minerals. USGS looking at the value chain of minerals is good news. We are facing a lot of protectionist measures these days, and looking at value chains in advance is extremely beneficial. And so we look forward to a win-win arrangement that will make us stronger as a region in North America. And I'll end by just saying that we will put forward a renewed action plan in Quebec for critical minerals. This plan is something extremely, it's a priority. It's really important in what we're doing in terms of the economy in Quebec. We've been consulting in 2020. And there's an additional consultation in August with First Nations. The plan should be ready in the autumn of 2020. And it basically looks at know-how, research, innovation, the circular economy and recycling, which Quebec is very well positioned in again, and how to accompany our promoters, inform and promote our industry. And I would turn it to my colleagues for the rest of the country, I guess.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Catherine. Now we turn to Ian Todd, who represents the province of Ontario in Washington. Ian.
Let me unmute there. Thank you, Chris. Really appreciate the opportunity. I found the presentations to be really very helpful. Obviously, Ontario has a big role to play through this process, like Quebec, and we, Catherine and I, work closely together on this issue and many other files, of course. Looking at the obvious opportunity in the development of the Ring of Fire, there's just really exciting opportunities and initiatives in Ontario taking place. We're taking a three-pronged approach. The Minister of Energy and Mines, Greg Rickford, works closely with Federal Minister O'Regan. They've got a great relationship. Our ministerial staff work closely with NRCan officials. And then of course, with me being in Washington, I work closely, I'm based in the Canadian Embassy. I work closely with my federal colleagues on US stakeholder engagement. So that's really our three-pronged approach on this. Ontario, as you likely know, has the regulatory parameters in place. So we look forward to playing an active role in being a partner with the other provinces and the federal government and working with our US counterparts. Some of you may not know this, but our supply chains are extremely strong. If Ontario was a standalone country, we'd be the third largest trading partner to the United States. So we've got 19 states where we're their #1 trading partner, and an additional 9 states where we're #2. So it's a very strong and highly integrated relationship. As was mentioned earlier, some of these products cross the border back and forth several times. So we're highly integrated, and of course the defense and national security issues aside, we look forward to being and playing an active role in these discussions.
Thank you very much, Ian. We'll now have time for just a few questions and answers, and we have a question that's come in from the State University of New York, Stony Brook. Professor writes, it's a fairly technical question, so apologies to the audience. I'm going to read it just to get it exactly right. They're doing some work on fluorescent light bulb powder, which includes yttrium, lanthanum, cerium, europium, and terbium, with the last two being particularly important. There is, from our fluorescent bulbs and so forth, there is a lot of material that goes straight into recycling, or, well, not even recycling, goes straight into the dump. And so the question is, are some of these materials related to fluorescent bulbs on the list of critical minerals that the US and Canada are working on? And is there greater recycling potential that might come out of this collaborative agreement? I might ask Sarah Riker if you could start with an answer on that, and then perhaps Andrew?
Sure, happy to. Really interesting question. The list of 35 critical minerals includes over a dozen that in fact are primarily byproducts. And so for those, no one expects increased direct extractive activity. However, there's a strong interest in both recycling and recapturing some of those materials at the end of product lives, but also reprocessing of mine wastes. And of course, there's, as Robert mentioned earlier, there are a number of motivations for reprocessing of mine waste, including environmental cleanup, as well as the potential to recover resources, and in particular resources that weren't valued back in the heyday of US mining. And so I think there's a lot of space to explore there. Frankly, we are not strong enough in this country in recycling nor reprocessing of significant mine wastes to currently make much of a dent in gaps in our supply chain. However, we have some interesting analyses of specific supply chains, and for example, identified tantalum as one commodity for which, should we in fact better recycle and reprocess domestic waste, product waste, we could potentially reduce our dependence on supplies from thorny supply chains in areas such as the Congo. And so there's a great deal of potential to explore the space and to strengthen our supply chains domestically and with reliable trading partners, in part by better exploiting wastes. And I will say in the United States as well, not every state has active extractive industry outside of construction materials and industrial materials. However, every state has legacy mining lands and mine wastes, and every state has electronics recycling. So we see, in terms of volume of material and also specific types of materials, enormous potential in that area. There is a clear policy gap, and we lack some of the mechanics to better exploit all those wastes. Those are actually areas in which we are very interested in learning more from Canada, as we understand that the provinces in particular have, in some cases, enacted much stronger policies around recapture of some of those high-value materials.
So as Andrew, I can jump in to do my best to answer that. So obviously, recycling and I think, as Sarah alluded to, mining from waste are kind of key priorities. NRCan actually has a R&D program associated with mining from waste, and I think it offers great potential, not just in the sense of environmental remediation from tailings or from abandoned mine sites, but there's also an opportunity to kind of use that as a springboard in terms of a new source of supply while obviously because it takes some time for a mine to get underway, so you have this economic opportunity associated with that as well. The recycling component I'm a little less well versed in, but obviously that is another component that I think of our overall strategy that we're ensuring is integrated. I think sometimes within Canada itself, the scale of it in terms of being able to have enough throughput can be somewhat of a challenge at times. But as we look for more environmentally sustainable solutions, recycling of a variety of products and materials will definitely be front and center.
It's a question about the USMCA, the trade agreement that took effect on July 1. Can anyone comment on whether the USMCA makes critical minerals trade more secure? And is that potentially sort of a plus up on top of the joint action plan that the two governments have in place? I was going to direct it to someone, I'm not sure, but yeah, Andrew, if you want.
Sure. So I think obviously USMCA is a reflection of a high degree of integration that already exists between our two economies, and I think it just further builds on that. So if anything, that framework just provides further momentum and to increase trade in critical minerals and cooperation within that area. I don't know the ins and outs in terms of tariff regimes and things like that with respect to these elements, but that framework in place provides additional competitiveness to our two economies, and it facilitates things like investment as well within this space. So I think that having the framework of USMCA again provides that competitiveness foundation through which to kind of build the critical minerals as another area of our two economies.
Robert, I was wondering if I could pass that question on to you in a slightly different way. The two governments have been talking back and forth about renewing national security tariffs under the 1962 Trade Expansion Act, Section 232, on aluminum. Aluminum, steel, and other materials in some ways are also critical and strategic. Do you think that this trade friction is something that could be addressed in the context of collaboration on critical materials, or do you think that this is likely to sour trade relations?
I think to play the political commentator, I think that I think the political dynamics, the policy drivers of the critical minerals strategy for Canada, I think were very well explained on both sides. I think part of the political dynamic is when you have had friction over the NAFTA/USMCA renegotiation and Section 232 and the Paris Agreement and on and on and on. I think this is a great area politically for the Trudeau government to engage in an area where there was mutual interest to maybe offset the friction on 232 and the initial stages of the USMCA and dairy and all the things that went with that. So I think the politics around that do make sense. And I think that the 232 issue itself in the second go around now in aluminum shouldn't disrupt the larger dynamics that we're talking about around critical minerals or the larger economic cooperation, but it's sort of an irritant in that larger context.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that, Robert. I want to thank all of our panelists as we've come up to time. Sarah Riker, Andrew Gaddis, Robert Johnston, and also I want to thank the provinces, Catherine Louvier and Ian Todd, for weighing in on what they're up to. I think there is a lot of ground for collaboration here. We will return to this subject in future events. Final shout out to the team at the Woodrow Wilson Center that made this event possible. Thanks to everyone, and we will look forward to more discussions like this very soon.